Hopefully it won't feel too schooly, but we'll see about that. So I'm, again, A.T. Kingsmith. I'm like a lecturer, instructor, researcher. I teach at OCAD, I teach at Humber. I'm interested in mental health, depression, anxiety, creativity, and AI. And we're going to look at kind of how some of these things intersect today. Obviously, AI is something that's kind of like a buzzword. And I think a lot of people are kind of wondering, is it this thing that next year there'll be a new thing and we'll replace AI with this new thing, kind of like before we talked about the blockchain, NFTs, right, moving through buzzwords. So we're going to look at some of those tensions, right? How does AI affect our mental health, and what is the connection to like creativity, right? And I think underlying a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is this kind of key paradox in a lot of my research. So I did my PhD on like the politics of anxiety and how we live in this society where a lot of times it seems like the more mental health care we get access to, the worse our mental health gets. The more prescriptions you're on, the more apps you download. These are just new things that either make you addicted or make you feel like you can't keep up or make you feel like a failure. And so we're going to try and understand this paradox a bit. Is this on purpose? Is this an accident? What's the difference? Why does our mental health care seem to make our mental health worse? Okay, and so that's a lot of what I want to talk about today and how we can link it to creativity and AI. And so just to give you a sense of how the conversation is going to kind of go, so we're going to do a bit of a reality check. What is our relationship to technology in this kind of modern age? How much time do we spend on our screens? How are these things good? How are these things bad? Right? It's always going to be many things. It's never going to be one thing, right? It's never either good or bad. It's both and other things, okay? We're going to look at EIQ in 2025, so emotional intelligence. What does that look like in this kind of modern age? What's the scene of AI and mental health care? What are sort of the different things going on in that kind of larger scene? Some creative strategies we can use to kind of like leverage AI to make our mental health better, okay? And then some things we can do sort of moving forward. So just off the bat, right, reality check. So how AI drives our day, right? So your morning probably looked something like this morning, okay? 7 a.m., get up and do your TikTok scroll. Algorithm serves you that initial dopamine hit. Okay, your brain feels that first high of the day. Okay, 7:15, Spotify's perfect playlist, algorithmically engineered to satisfy you, kicks in. Now your mood has been influenced. Okay, 8 o'clock, got to check your Instagram. Okay, do some comparisons, jack up that FOMO, right? Make sure that you feel like you're missing out on things that you should have stayed out last night and not gone to bed early. Okay, 8:30, the Slack messages from work come in, the stress is triggered. Okay, so already in this 90-minute interval, we've been influenced by algorithms in 4, 5, 6 different ways, right? Giving us that dopamine hit, influencing our mood, making us compare, making us feel stressed. Okay, so let's think about nighttime. I think we could probably assume that the routine is somewhat similar. Your evenings, right? AI recipe suggestions, got that decision fatigue creaking in, okay? 8:15, Netflix recommended series, again, influence your mood. These days, most of these series are actually designed and produced by algorithms. So like less and less personal influence in the creative process, okay? 9:30, we got our bedtime scrolling, FOMO activated, right? Okay, I said an hour and 15 minutes, let's be honest, try like 4 hours and 15 minutes, but let's pretend that you stopped at 10:15 so you can start tracking your sleep so you can make sure that you're also really good at optimizing how much you sleep, and you better not mess it up because then you'll feel bad. Okay, so as we can see, right, there's just all these ways in which we are living in an age of constant algorithmic nudges. Okay, algorithms are pushing us and pulling us in all these kinds of different directions, and we're not really aware of the process. I think these questions kind of help highlight what I mean. When was the last time you had a meal without staring into a piece of technology, especially by yourself, right? When was the last time you weren't looking at your phone, your computer, or your television? So I try and keep this close so I project across the room. So, right, most of us, right, we can talk about this at the end, but it's probably been a while. When you're stressed, right, what do you do to deal with your stress? Do you go seek some form of exercise, go for a walk? You probably reach for your screen, right? You think it's gonna make you feel better. I promise you it is not, okay? Right? Another thing to think about here is this tension around like when did likes, okay, become linked to self-worth? A question I always ask my students, right? Have you ever posted a video or a picture and it didn't get the amount of likes that you expected it to get in like an hour window, so you deleted it, right? Everybody puts their hand up, basically. Okay, the second thing I ask is like, do you ever feel better about yourself and your identity after you use social media? Nobody's hands went up. Okay, so we know implicitly that these things probably aren't great for us. But there's this kind of underlying tension here in that they keep pulling us in, right? Like, why is that? And so again, a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next, let's say, like 35, 40 minutes is like how this process works, right? Again, when the last question I ask my students in this line of thinking is like, when Facebook and Instagram were trying to design their first apps, who do you think they hired to design their apps for them? Students say graphic designers, they say engineers. The reality is they hired the people who build slot machines. Okay, this is described perfectly in this book called Addiction by Design. The goal is to make us addicted to these things, right? It's not a side effect, it's part of the design principles of these products. Okay, so the question that I want to frame a lot of our conversation around today is what makes us human in a world where AI never sleeps? You need to take breaks, AI does not, right? So what makes us human? And maybe, does that thing that makes us human, is that our comparative advantage, our competitive advantage, the thing that can make us creative in this kind of modern AI age? So this is the paradox I was talking about at the outset, right? We have this tension. We have these powerful tools for creativity and self-expression. You know, things like Canva, things like generative AI that allow people to make things they never would have been able to make without these tools. That is objectively a good thing, right? We have these global networks. You have your Discord servers. Okay, you have your social media networks. We have all these people that we're connected to, right? We can track our wellness across the day, right? We track everything. We track our fitness, we track our periods, we track our eating intake, we track our sleeping. Everything is optimized and tracked, okay? We got this 24/7 support. So in a lot of ways, this makes us feel empowered, right? We have access to all this technology, all these tools to help us optimize our lives. At the other end of this paradox is this tension around alienation. Right? People today are more lonely than they've ever been in human history. Okay? Again, like when I ask my students, you have 10,000 followers on this platform, if your car broke down, how many people would come help you fix the tire? 2? 3? Even that? Right? Maybe 30, 40 years ago you knew 10 people, but 4 or 5 of them would have come help you. This is the tension here, right? We live in this age where we have all this digital validation, but also constant comparison, FOMO. It sort of drives a negative self-image. It undermines, in a lot of ways, in-person real community, right? So the reality is we have these diminished real-world connections in this larger context of all this empowerment. So the reality is that we're more connected, yet more isolated. Right? More informed, yet more anxious. We're supported, yet alone, struggle to be present. Right? And to be honest, this might be the first time I've talked in front of a group of people for 5 or 6 minutes and I haven't really seen anybody staring into their phones. My students will not even look up to watch the videos about how you shouldn't stare into your phones because they're too busy staring into their phones. Okay? So the challenge is, how do we harness the power of technology and AI while preserving genuine human connection and creativity? Okay, and I'm going to try and give us some answers to that question, keeping in mind that people might disagree with me and it's a complicated question. So let's talk a bit about the state of AI in 2025, right? We just had our reality check. We all feel guilty now sufficiently about how much we use our phones. I don't even want to know how many hours a day you all spend on your phones, okay? But let's talk about what is AI and its connection to emotion. Okay, so this piece of data is from my PhD research on my dissertation. Okay, I'm interested in like alternative forms of data because I spent a lot of my dissertation critiquing a lot of the statistics around anxiety and depression and how things like the WHO get those things set. I was more interested in what people are actually doing in their homes. This is Google search terms. So this is Google search terms of the word anxiety from January 2004 for 20 years up until January, March 2023. Okay, and so as we can see, there's a clear trend here that like people are turning to the internet to be like, I have anxiety, what do I do? Okay, and what's interesting here is you can actually correlate this. Does anyone want to take a guess what this spike is? February, March 2020. Does anyone remember what happened February, March 2020? COVID pandemic, right? So we can map a lot of the increase in anxiety that people are kind of feeling across like what they're using to try and get solutions to this problem. Okay, so we can see that there's a general trend upward, that people are using this concept, feeling this concept. Again, as I always say in my work, like, I'm not necessarily interested in whether anxiety is going up or down, because we'd have to accept all these metrics to map that. What I'm interested in is how come anxiety is the buzzword that everybody uses to describe how they're feeling. In the 90s, maybe it was like panic, okay? Like there's been other words, there's been other concepts, but we're in this age where anxiety is the descriptor we choose to invoke, okay, to talk about how we're feeling. So, like the market, you know, let's talk about numbers, let's talk about the rise in emotion AI. So this is a conservative estimate, okay, on the growth of the emotion AI market, right? Again, using AI to try and engage with emotions and mental health, right? So here we are, 2025, around $1 billion, up to $2.3 billion by 2030, okay? I think this is a more realistic estimate. The market now is like 4.4 bill. We're going to go to 7.66 in the next 5 years. It's an annual growth rate of 11%. So it's a massive, massive, massive market, right? People have this tool, they have this solution, and they're in search of problems to force the solution into, okay? So I want to talk a little now at the core of like, what do I mean when I talk about emotions? Right? Because we talk about emotion AI, mental health, creativity. We're throwing these words, or I'm throwing these words around, and it's important, I think, to define our terms. So when I talk about emotions and emotional intelligence and emotional life, this is the model that I'm using for emotions. Okay? I'm going to pull a few notes here. So, right, the first kind of outside layer is the raw kind of initial way in which your body responds to emotions. It's like the outer ring. Okay, so it's like your raw experience. So this would be like the noisy, unfiltered ways in which we first experience an emotion. So like the stomach drops after you read an email that you don't like, or feeling embarrassed in a meeting, or feeling excited when you get good news. This is the kind of body's initial reaction to an emotional stimuli. Okay, so we're not really processing it, we're just purely feeling it. Like you can feel your face flushed when you read that email you don't want to get. The next layer of emotional processing is this middle or meso layer. Okay, so this is the recognition phase. This is the aha moment of the awareness. Okay, I'm getting defensive. Okay, I'm getting angry. You're becoming aware of the response to the emotional stimuli. Okay. The third is the inner. So now you have your conscious response. What are you going to choose to do in this moment to respond to the emotion? Okay, so again, as we can see, there's kind of 3 layers. You think of it almost like an emotion would be like a sound wave hitting the body. Okay, the first hit is the outer. You kind of just respond to the stimuli. Again, your face flushes, you yawn when you're tired. Okay, at the meso level, now you're starting to recognize patterns. Think, okay, maybe I'm getting angry. Okay, and at the inner level, now you're deciding how am I going to respond to this stimuli. Okay, so that is kind of like the model that we're using when we talk about like the ways machines are trying to think about emotions. Okay, this is kind of like how the body processes and becomes aware of emotions. Okay, so keeping that in mind, right, when we think about what is emotional intelligence in practice, okay, a lot of it kind of comes down to these core skills, right? And again, they're things that a lot of us probably do all the time, but it's hard to articulate them. Okay? It's kind of like walking. We walk, all of us, all the time, but if you had to describe to somebody who'd never walked before, how do you walk? It's actually very difficult to do that. What do I like, make my brain put my feet in front of? Like, how would you verbalize that? How would you reduce it to a series of commands? Okay? These are kind of the series of things that emotional intelligence is trying to capture, right? So like reading the room, reading between the lines, right? Picking up on like body language, right? Sharing like genuine laughter, connecting, understanding a joke with someone else, okay? Again, feeling what other people feel, right? Things like empathy, okay? Understanding complex contexts, like, okay, someone just went through a tragic event, but they seem to be laughing because they're having a complex traumatic response that isn't clearly kind of sad or happy, right? And then building real trust. Okay, so these are kind of the core fundamentals of how to practice emotional intelligence. right? And in a lot of ways, these core fundamentals, like there's lots of examples in the creative field of how these things can like improve your work. So back to the notes. So I have a few stories I want to share, right? Stories from the kind of design field, stories from creativity, to just connect this to the creative industry. Okay, the ways in which like using emotional intelligence can really teach us a valuable lesson about like why emotions are important, and why we really need to think twice about how they interact with AI, and why we're letting kind of technology do the emoting for us. Okay, so the first one is design teams' daily emotional check-ins transformed in their work. Okay, so just painting this picture. Imagine like a small design firm, 6 people, okay, and they're kind of having a struggle in their kind of morning meetings because nobody's really talking about how they're feeling. When the boss is like, everyone's good, they're gonna get their tasks done, everyone's like, yep, yep, yep. No one's really communicating clearly. So if you introduce a kind of emotional intelligence model here, right, you can have a setup where you have a color system. So you can introduce this idea that we have red when you're overwhelmed, yellow when you're challenged but managing, or green when you're feeling energized, right? And so the impact of something like this is that people can find a new way to talk about challenges when they're stuck. And the first kind of fundamental lesson of emotional intelligence is it's okay to be open when you can't do something. Okay, like limits, challenges, things you can't do are like opportunities to learn, right? Like the hardest thing I had to learn as a professor was when my students asked me a question I didn't know the answer, to be like, I actually don't know. I will go find the answer and bring it back next time. It's a lot easier in a room where people are gonna be deferent to just say some bullshit. And like they won't really question it because what do you wanna, like they don't wanna lose their grade. Okay, but the emotional intelligence here is like, I actually don't know. And I'll look it up. And that's not a weakness, it's a strength. Because I'm being open about the limits of my knowledge, and I'm going to find the right answer somewhere else. Okay? Another example, right? How a burnt out social media manager reclaimed their peace. So I'm sure some of you in the creative industry are managing multiple social media accounts all the time. It's probably super stressful, right? The lesson here, when you're trying to juggle all these things and fit it into your life, working as much as you can doesn't necessarily make you as productive as possible, right? Sometimes you need to actually like, and we were talking about this, like sometimes you need to I don't take emails after 8 p.m. or I don't open these accounts before 9 a.m., right? Like, and again, the lesson here, the thinking here is like, you think that makes you a worse employee, it actually makes you a better one. Because you can actually, when you're in your job, bring that focus, bring that energy, right? And you're not just like forcing yourself to drain, to be burnt out all the time. Okay, so, right, first lesson, it's okay to have limits to your knowledge, be open about them. Right? Second lesson, it's okay to take time for yourself, and you don't have to justify or explain why to somebody else, right? Okay, the third thing here, right, is it's important to try and track your emotional patterns. Okay, one of the things that we're going to work on today in the kind of next 20 minutes or so is to think a bit more about like, how do we become more aware of the ways our bodies are responding to certain stimuli, and how do we kind of track these patterns so we can make interventions in our life? Okay, so I think we'll talk a little bit now about the mental health scene and how AI kind of interconnects with that, and then we'll move into a couple practical strategies for how we can try and like use mental health tools to think about our relationship with AI and to like, again, create a situation where these things don't just become further sources of our depression and our anxiety. So, across the mental health scene, I would say there's like 5 core issues. 5 core issues that really affect how mental health works in our society. Okay? The first is feelings, in the sense that like, can an AI really get your feelings? Think back to that emotional circle we talked about a few minutes ago, right? The key with a human being that makes them emote, okay, is like their body. Is your epidermis. Like you have a body that you carry around, you have skin that interfaces with like the wind and the sun, and these things don't exist in AI. It doesn't have these receptors. It can't like pick up information in that way. It can only pick up information that's been kind of processed and plugged into it, right? It can't like discreetly feel things through its senses. Okay, so the first question when it comes to feelings is like, is AI really feeling things, or is it just mimicking and kind of copying things. And how do we understand the difference there between feeling something and mimicking or copying? We're going to come back to all these in the next slide. Okay? The next tension is privacy. Right? When we think about privacy, the tension in the AI mental health space is a lot of times like your data is not being used in ways that you would want it to be. Right? Your data is being sold to other companies. It's being aggregated into random surveys. It's being used for marketing. Okay, it's being used for nudges. Like there isn't a lot of understanding around like people's privacy. Okay. Another tension is this tension of access. Right? When we have technology in the mental health space, that can be a really good thing. Like in Canada, there's only one therapist for every 5,000 Canadians. That's not enough, especially in like a kind of post-COVID world. So yeah, therapy can allow for scalability, right? Therapy can allow, like digital AI-driven therapy can allow more people to get access to therapy, okay? It can reach places that no therapist can. But then the question becomes like, is it a valid substitute for therapy, right? What are the things a therapist can do that AI can't do, right? And we were talking about this a little bit before the session, right? One of the tensions with something like generative AI, like ChatGPT, for example, right, is that these products are designed to please you. It is a product that is designed to justify its continued use in the future. The whole point of a therapist is that you're paying this person to tell you things you probably don't really want to hear, to tell you things that you need to hear to make your life better, but they're going to be hard. The goal of Gen AI is to get you to keep using it. So it's going to tell you everything that you want to hear. It kind of makes it not always the greatest tool for like a substitute for therapy. Okay? Another tension is this question of bias, right? Across mental health and AI in general, we see a lot of biases. A simple example of this is if you asked like Canadian kids where they would have anxiety in their bodies, they'd probably point to their heads. If you ask kids in China where is their anxiety, they would probably point to their stomachs. So even this idea of like where different kinds of mental health challenges appear in the body and how that process works, right, usually takes the Western model to be like the standard model, and everything else is kind of deviant from that, okay? And then finally we have this question of de-skilling. I think this is a really, really big problem in this kind of AI moment, okay? In the sense that like we're using AI to do a lot of the emotional labor that we used to have to do. To write emails to colleagues, to like have a hard conversation with a kid or a parent. You're having it draft this text for you. You're having it do the emotional labor for you. And then the question a lot of people are asking is like, is this gonna make us worse at emoting? Because we're having the AI do our emoting for us. And if you assume that emotional intelligence is like a muscle, and if you don't exercise it, you get worse at it, okay, then using AI to do your emoting for you could lead to a less emotionally intelligent society. Okay, and again, what is emotional intelligence? Emotional intelligence is like how we all get along together in public. It's like when you're on the subway and someone bumps into you, you don't start a fight with them. Okay, like that's this, and I think we can all see if you spend time in public space in Toronto, since the pandemic, people's emotional intelligence has gone down. People are more on edge. People are more aggro. People are more confrontational over like little things. And I think a lot of that is related to this larger emotional and moral de-skilling, in that we're not doing the emotional labor anymore to like understand how to be together in real life, right? Which is why events like this are so important. So just to break down kind of the key takeaways here, right? It's always both positive and negative, right? I focus a lot on the negative sometimes because I think sometimes the analysis focuses way too much on the positive parts. But there are both sides. So when we talk about feelings, right? There are potentials here, lots of real-time emotion tracking insights. We can look at moods, we can detect patterns, okay? Privacy, we can encrypt platforms, confidential, discrete support, access, teletherapy apps, right? Bias, okay, we can train AI models with more diverse data in theory to try and make them less biased. Of course, you have to go and collect that data, which people aren't always doing, but we can automate tasks to free people up to focus on more human-centered care, okay? But there are then these pitfalls, right? AI in some ways lacks the ability to produce genuine empathy, at least as we understand it now. It seems like it's largely copying what it sees, not actually genuinely emoting. Okay, there's always risks of data breaches, personal insights shared with third parties, okay? access, right, requires reliable internet. It's a thing that we take for granted, but when I teach courses online, sometimes I have students who are like, I don't have fast internet, or I don't have access to a quiet room where I can do this class online, right? So it's easy to forget in this digital age where we're all so connected that still is a question of accessibility, right? Bias, and as I said before, right, algorithms often reflect kind of majority norms. Okay, I was talking to someone before the session today, and they were like, what kind of stuff do you talk about in your class at OCAD? And a lot of my mental health class at OCAD, we talk about like the standards around what is normal behavior and how that's changed over the past 50, 60, 70 years. What is normal behavior? What is deviant behavior, right? These categories are shifting and changing, okay? And the problem is that a lot of these algorithms are kind of reproducing certain biased understandings of like, what is a healthy body? What is a healthy way to behave? What is an unhealthy way to behave? Okay? And then again, finally, as I said before, de-skilling. So an over-reliance on AI tools can sometimes erode personal coping skills and resilience. Okay, so how this idea of doing good, how tech doing good can sometimes make things worse, right? Just to try and explain, flush out a bit of this paradox. Okay, so there's going to be 4 things I'm going to talk quickly about, then we'll get into some practical strategies on how to manage this stuff. Okay, so the first thing that AI is doing sometimes to your mental health through technology, okay, it's manipulating you through gamification. Okay, so again, gamification is just the idea of like creating a series of accomplishable tasks or a list, okay, that you need to then go forward and do to try and stimulate you. So a simple example would be like when you want to do your grocery shopping and you really don't want to do it, you make a list. Because then there's the satisfaction of crossing things off the list. That's the rudimentary gamification. You're gamifying going grocery shopping. Okay? But if you remember what I said before, a lot of these apps these days are designed by slot machine designers. And so they're using the addictive principles of gamification to keep you on the platform as long as possible. Okay, there's this podcast a few years ago that came out from the New York Times called Rabbit Hole. And they talk about this big change in the tech space when YouTube switched its recommender algorithms, right? Recommender algorithms are the things that pick the next video for you. When it switched its incentive from most views to most amount of time spent watching. So the goal no longer was to get as many views as possible, but to maximize the amount of time people spent watching the videos. So there was a switch in the logic, and the goal became to keep you glued to the seat as long as possible. Right? One of the smartest things that Netflix ever did was make the next show start automatically after the last one. Right? I think we can agree we just kind of sit there, let the binge just kind of go over you, right? And like, again, we're unique in this sense. Like, I think up until 30 years ago, people never consumed media this way. For like 12 hours in a row in a spot. You would just go to your movie and then you'd go home or something else. You wouldn't just be hooked up to the feeder and like it's just kind of coming in. Right? We're at this point now where like, might as well make those shows with algorithms too and just close the loop, right? And so the first point, right, is that in a lot of ways, our attention is being manipulated to keep us on these platforms, not always in our own interest, right? If the product is free, you are the product, okay? The second thing is that our data gets sold. Right? Mozilla Firefox did a big study of all the top mental health apps, 27 of them. Lots of ones we've all used, Calm, Headspace, okay? Only 17 of them have any data privacy or data security. So like your personal data about how you're feeling in your mental health is not really being secured, right? At least me personally, that just like makes my anxiety worse. And I have anxiety about my anxiety data, okay? Another one is the efficacy of chatbots. Okay, I'm sure we've heard lots of examples of this, but there's been a few cases now of young folks especially using chatbots in like moments of vulnerability to like try and talk some things out, and it's in some ways led or been in some ways linked to some suicidality. So there's a couple kids in the States, a couple kids in Europe that are using these chatbots, in particular ones called Character AI, to like make a friend, to have a conversation, okay? And again, like, it's hard to always know, like there's probably other factors that lead to these events, but I think in general we can say that it seems to have been like an isolating force here. And so it brings this larger question of like, when you replace a therapist with an AI system, like what are you losing there, right? For sure, more people have access to care and support, and like we don't have enough therapists, but like what is being lost in that choice? And is there a way that we could maybe use like some of this tech as a bridge and then get someone into that therapy care later, right? The final thing, okay, and I talk with my students about this so much because this happens to all of us, is the medicalization and the psychiatrization of everyday life. These are big words, but all it means is like totally normal human behaviors now become mental problems. So like you have anxiety at work because you can't give a presentation in front of 10 people, that's pretty reasonable anxiety. I don't think you need to go to a therapist and get a diagnosis of anti-anxiety medication because you are uncomfortable talking to 10 people. That's a normal human reaction. I talk to people all the time and I was nervous before I did this. So like, well, I'm not gonna take medication for that. Like, in fact, in some ways the nervousness makes me prepare extra and do a good job, right? So we're medicalizing things that aren't medical problems. Right? And again, we talk a lot about this in my field around things like, we call it prescription cascade. And the point is like, eventually you start taking so many medications that the side effects of all these medications are worse than the initial problem that you had in the first place. So a simple example, right? Again, anxiety at work because you can't present in front of 10 people, so you get pushed by your employer to go to the psychiatrist to get your medication. Now you're taking these anti-anxiety pills. Now you got no problem presenting in front of people, but now you can't sleep. Is a side effect of the pills. So now you go back to the psychiatrist, you got to get another medication which can help you sleep, and now you don't have any appetite. Now you go back there again, and eventually get to a point where like you can't sleep, you got no appetite, like those things are worse than like you were a little nervous talking in front of 5, 10 people. It's a bigger problem now than it was before. So this tension here, when we medicalize all these routine interactions amongst people, it's okay to be nervous sometimes. It's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes, right? Those things sometimes are like growing pains. It makes you better at something. But we're trying to create this kind of totally smooth world in which none of those things happen anymore. And the only way to really do that is to have us all hopped up on like medications and stuff. Okay, so this last one is like things that aren't really mental health problems are now treated as mental health problems. Okay?